Kash Patel destroys The View, sparks fly, live on air. It was a typical morning on The View, but today was different. Kash Patel, former national security advisor under the Trump administration, stepped onto the set. The moment the doors opened, the air in the studio shifted. The usual light-hearted chatter fell silent. Patel wasn't just a guest, he was the subject of the show's most anticipated interview in months. The co-hosts were ready. Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, and Sunny Hostin had their notes in hand, their faces, stern expressions unreadable. This wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. They knew Patel's reputation for challenging the establishment, and they were prepared to push him hard. After all, Patel had been a polarizing figure, one who had constantly been at the center of controversial political debates. But Kash Patel wasn't intimidated. He walked into the studio with a calm composure, not a hint of the anxiety that might plague any ordinary guest about to be grilled on national television. His eyes scanned the table of hosts before he took his seat. He wasn't there to perform. He wasn't there to play the victim. He was there to defend his views, and he knew what was coming. The show began as usual with the co-hosts, starting with predictable small talk. They asked about Patel's time in the FBI, his work with national security, and his role in the Trump administration. The questions were polite, but beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Every host at the table had their own personal agenda. They wanted answers, and they weren't going to back down. It didn't take long before Whoopi Goldberg dove into the real interview. With a straight face and a sharp tone, she asked, "So, Mr. Patel, you've said some things about media accountability that have raised eyebrows. Some critics say you're flirting with censorship. Where exactly do you draw the line between free speech and control?" The studio fell silent. The audience waited for Patel's response. Was he going to deflect? Was he going to play it safe and give them a typical political answer, or would he rise to the occasion and turn the tables? Patel didn't flinch. He met Whoopi's gaze with unblinking intensity. "I support the First Amendment," he said, his voice calm yet unwavering. "But that doesn't mean we turn a blind eye to deliberate misinformation. Freedom comes with responsibility, especially for those who shape public opinion every day." The room buzzed slightly. It wasn't the answer the host had expected. It wasn't a deflection. It wasn't an apology either. Patel stood firm, delivering his response with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. It was clear this wasn't going to be an easy interview for anyone at the table. Joy Behar leaned in, sensing the opportunity to push further. She was quick to fire back, her voice sharper now. "But who decides what counts as misinformation? Mr. Patel? Because some would argue that you've been part of pushing narratives that weren't entirely factual." Patel's eyes shifted briefly to the audience as if weighing their response. He paused, letting the question linger in the air before responding with conviction. "That's exactly the conversation we need to be having," he said, his tone measured but assertive. Not shouting matches, not labels, actual uncomfortable conversations like this one. The audience reacted, a subtle murmur rippling through the crowd. Something had shifted. It wasn't overt, there wasn't applause or cheers, but there was a sense that Patel was gaining ground. He wasn't cowering under pressure. He wasn't trying to evade the hard questions. He was engaging. He was willing to face the difficult conversations head on. The tension at the table was growing. Whoopi's face tightened, and Sunny Hostin, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward, preparing for her turn. She wasn't going to let Patel off easy. "So, Mr. Patel," she began, "you've defended people who've attacked the press. How can you claim to respect journalism when you've aligned yourself with efforts to undermine it?" The stakes had just been raised. Patel was now being accused of undermining the very institution he had been defending journalism. It was a calculated move. Sunny was no stranger to confronting guests with uncomfortable truths, but Patel wasn't backing down. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he took his time, choosing his words carefully. "I respect journalism," Patel said slowly, "but I don't respect lies packaged as news. And I think every American deserves the truth, even if it's inconvenient to the narrative." The words hung in the air. The crowd shifted again, this time more audibly. Some clapped lightly. Others simply nodded as if they were starting to hear something they hadn't expected. But the hosts weren't done yet. They were digging in, determined to push Patel to a breaking point. They weren't going to let him slip away from these questions so easily. The interview had barely scratched the surface, but already it was clear that this wasn't going to be the easy, one-sided conversation the host had hoped for. Patel was standing his ground, and the tables were slowly starting to turn. The question was, how long would it take before the host realized they had underestimated him? The next few minutes would prove pivotal. No one at the table was quite ready for what would come next. As the conversation continued, the host began to realize that Kash Patel wasn't going to make this easy for them. With each response, he managed to slip past their attempts to corner him, leaving them with nothing but their own frustration. They had prepared for a heated interview, but what they hadn't expected was a guest who refused to be rattled. Joy Behar, frustrated by Patel's calm demeanor, was the next to strike. She shifted in her seat and leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to launch another attack. "You've defended people who've attacked the press, Kash," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And now you're sitting here claiming to respect journalism. How do you reconcile that?" Patel didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, meeting Joy's gaze with an unwavering stare. He had anticipated this question. After all, he had been called everything from a liar to an enemy of the press by his critics. But Patel was used to these attacks. He had faced worse in his career. "I do respect journalism," he replied, his voice steady. "But I don't respect people who manipulate the truth to fit a political narrative. Journalism is supposed to hold power accountable. It's not supposed to be a tool for advancing a specific agenda." The words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them sinking in. For a brief second, the audience was silent, as if they too were waiting for the hosts to respond. But none of the hosts had an immediate comeback. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "So you think this show is part of that agenda?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Patel didn't hesitate. "I think every media outlet, including this one, has at some point pushed a narrative without fully examining the facts, and I think that's dangerous. The public deserves better than that." Whoopi's face tightened. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, not in her own studio. She glanced at Joy and Sunny, silently signaling for them to pick up the pace. Patel wasn't just defending himself. He was attacking their credibility piece by piece. Sunny Hostin, who had been listening intently, finally broke her silence. "You've been part of an administration that has done nothing but attack the media," she said, her voice sharp. "You've been complicit in undermining the press. How can you sit here and lecture us about responsibility?" Patel didn't back down. He was prepared for this. He had heard it all before. "I didn't attack the press," he said, his tone unwavering. "I criticized the press when it pushed false narratives. That's not the same as attacking the press, but if we're going to hold politicians accountable, we need to hold the media accountable too." The room grew quieter as Patel's words sank in. The hosts exchanged glances, but they couldn't find a way to respond that wouldn't make them seem defensive. Patel wasn't just winning the argument, he was controlling the narrative, and the more they pressed, the more they revealed their own biases. The tension in the room was palpable. The audience was still almost as if they too were holding their breath. And that's when it happened, a moment that would shift everything. Whoopi Goldberg, the show's most experienced host, tried to regain control of the interview. She leaned forward again, a slight smirk on her face, as she asked, "So let me get this straight. You're claiming that the media should be held accountable for pushing false narratives. But are you saying that every media outlet is guilty of this?" Patel nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "Every media outlet has been guilty of pushing a narrative that doesn't fully reflect the facts. It's not about whether you agree with me or not. It's about ensuring that the truth isn't ignored in favor of a narrative that fits a specific agenda." For a moment, there was silence. Whoopi's expression was unreadable. She wasn't sure how to respond. This wasn't the fight she had expected. Patel wasn't just defending himself, he was challenging everything they had stood for as journalists. The rest of the interview played out in much the same way. The host continued to ask Patel tough questions, but they couldn't break his composure. Each time they attempted to push him, he responded with facts, logic, and an unwavering commitment to his beliefs. He wasn't just surviving the interview, he was dominating it. But the real turning point came when Whoopi, frustrated by Patel's answers, attempted to pivot to a new topic, the FBI. She had hoped this would be a more comfortable line of questioning, one that would allow her to regain control. But Patel wasn't about to let her off the hook. "Do you believe the FBI is politicized?" Whoopi asked, almost challengingly. Patel paused for a moment, weighing his words. "Yes," he said, finally. Parts of it are. And that should concern everyone, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. The response was swift and it was loud. The audience reacted with murmurs and even some applause. Patel wasn't just making a statement, he was echoing the concerns of many Americans who believed that the FBI had become too politically driven. It was a bombshell moment, one that sent shockwaves through the studio. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, visibly taken aback. She had hoped to use the FBI as a way to corner Patel, but he had flipped the question back on her, forcing her to confront a truth that many in the media were reluctant to acknowledge. Sunny Hostin was the next to speak, her voice edged with disbelief. "You think the FBI is politicized?" she asked. "But how do you explain the investigations into Trump's ties to Russia? How do you explain the countless investigations into him over the years?" Patel's response was calm and collected. "I think those investigations were politically motivated," he said, his voice steady. "And I think the American people deserve to know the truth, even if it's inconvenient." The room was silent again. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about trust. And Patel had just delivered a knockout blow. The hosts sat in stunned silence, struggling to regain their composure. They had thought they were in control, but Kash Patel had just flipped the script. The audience, too, was caught off guard by the sudden shift in power. It was clear now that Patel wasn't just another politician or media target. He was a force to be reckoned with. And as the interview continued, the tension only grew. Patel wasn't just answering questions, he was making the hosts question their own role in the media landscape. Every time they pressed, he responded with precision, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own biases. It was clear now this wasn't just an interview, it was a showdown, and Kash Patel was winning. As the conversation reached its boiling point, the host's frustration was palpable. Kash Patel had not just weathered their questions, he had dismantled them one by one, turning their own accusations back on them with cold precision. The interview had gone far beyond what anyone had expected. No one had anticipated Patel's level of composure or his ability to push back with such force. Whoopi Goldberg, usually the most experienced host in the room, was visibly shaken. She had tried to regain control of the conversation, but with each question, Patel only grew more resolute. The host had expected him to backtrack, maybe get defensive, but they hadn't counted on the quiet power he wielded. This wasn't just about policy, this was personal. And as Patel spoke, it became clear that he was making not just a political argument, but a moral one. Sunny Hostin, clearly irritated, took a deep breath and steeled herself for what she thought would be a final blow. "You've talked a lot about media accountability," she began, her voice sharp with accusation. "But let's talk about your role in the Trump administration. You were involved in some of the most controversial actions during his time in office. You defended policies that many people found deeply troubling. How do you reconcile that with your newfound concern for accountability?" Patel didn't flinch. He didn't let the question rattle him. "I'm not here to defend anyone's policies," he said calmly. "I'm here to talk about accountability. What I've always stood for is truth. And if we're going to demand accountability from the people in power, we have to start by holding the media accountable too. No one is above scrutiny, not even the people who shape public opinion." The audience reacted again. This time, there were more murmurs of agreement. Patel's words seemed to be hitting home. The hosts were no longer leading the conversation. Patel was. The shift in power was subtle, but undeniable. Whoopi, not willing to give up just yet, tried again. "You're saying that the media should be held accountable. Fine. But don't you think that in some cases the media was simply reporting what was in front of them? You can't claim that every piece of journalism is a false narrative." Patel's response was deliberate, measured. "No, I'm not claiming that. What I'm saying is that every media outlet has a responsibility to get the facts right. It's not enough to just report what's convenient. Sometimes the truth doesn't fit into a neat narrative, and that's where things go wrong." There was a long pause. The hosts exchanged glances again, but no one spoke immediately. It was a rare moment of silence on the show, but it was filled with unspoken tension. Patel wasn't just defending himself anymore, he was challenging their entire way of doing business, and that's when it happened. Joy Behar, who had been on the offensive for most of the interview, seemed to lose her patience. "So, are you saying that this show is part of the problem?" she asked, the edge in her voice unmistakable. "That we're pushing false narratives?" Patel's answer was straightforward, but it landed like a bombshell. "Yes, I think every media outlet has at some point been guilty of pushing a narrative that fits their agenda, and that's not something I'm willing to ignore. If we're going to talk about accountability, we have to talk about it for everyone, including the people who shape the public's perception. The room fell silent. The audience could feel it, a collective breath being held. The host had expected the conversation to unfold a certain way. They had expected Patel to stumble or give a rehearsed answer, but instead he was taking control. The hosts were no longer leading the discussion. Patel had turned the interview into an examination of their own credibility, their own biases. Whoopi, still trying to regain control, leaned back in her chair and asked, "So you're saying that this show, this platform, is part of the problem?" Patel looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. "I think every platform, including this one, has a responsibility to get the truth out. But sometimes the truth doesn't fit the narrative. And when that happens, people start to question whether they're being told the full story." Whoopi was visibly taken aback. It was clear that she hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. She glanced at Joy and Sunny as if to ask for support, but none came. Patel wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let them control the narrative any longer. And in that moment, it became clear Kash Patel was winning. The hosts were no longer in control. The audience was no longer just watching, they were listening. They were starting to think, to question, to wonder if the story they'd been told for so long was the real one. The rest of the interview unfolded with a growing sense of unease at the table. The hosts, though still attempting to question Patel, found themselves unable to land a decisive blow. Patel's calm, composed responses were chipping away at their arguments piece by piece. It wasn't just an interview anymore, it was a confrontation. And the hosts were beginning to realize that they might have underestimated their guest. As the interview wore on, the hosts began to feel the weight of their previous attempts to control the narrative. They had anticipated an easy interview, expecting Patel to crumble under pressure. But instead, they had created a battleground. Patel's unwavering composure and sharp responses had put them on the defensive. And as the minutes passed, it became increasingly clear that the interview was no longer just about politics, it was about power. The tension between Patel and the hosts was palpable. Each of them, once confident in their ability to dominate the conversation, now found themselves questioning their own positions. Kash Patel had flipped the script. He had started as a guest under their control, but now he was the one driving the conversation. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been a pillar of calm throughout the show, now seemed rattled. She had never faced an interview quite like this one. She was used to being the one in charge, used to setting the tone of the conversation. But Patel wasn't giving her the space she needed to direct the discussion. Every time she asked a question, he answered with clarity and conviction, often turning it back on her. "Are you implying that we're just a part of the media machine?" Whoopi asked, her voice laced with frustration. "That we don't have journalistic integrity?" Patel didn't hesitate. "I'm saying that every media outlet, including this one, is susceptible to bias," he replied. "And when you report news, especially in a climate as polarized as the one we're living in, the facts can get distorted. It's not about whether the media is inherently evil. It's about ensuring that the truth isn't lost in the process." Whoopi blinked, clearly caught off guard. She wasn't expecting such a direct answer. She tried to recover, shifting slightly in her chair, her mind clearly racing for the next move. "I respect the First Amendment," Patel continued, his tone unwavering. "But with that respect comes a responsibility to uphold the truth, and that includes holding the media accountable when they get it wrong." Joy Behar, who had been waiting for an opening, quickly jumped in. "But how can you stand there and preach about media accountability when you worked for a president who constantly attacked journalists?" Her voice was sharp, biting. "You were part of an administration that didn't just question the press, it demonized them." Patel looked at Joy, unfazed. "I never attacked journalists. I criticized them when they pushed false narratives," he said. "And there's a big difference between calling out misinformation and attacking an entire profession. I'm not here to defend anyone's actions. I'm here to defend the truth." The crowd reacted again. The tension in the room was now at a boiling point. Patel's words were resonating with the audience, who were no longer just passive spectators. They were engaged, leaning in, listening intently to every word he spoke. Sunny Hostin, clearly on edge, attempted to steer the conversation back to familiar territory. "Let's talk about your role in the Trump administration," she said, trying to regain control. You defended policies that many people saw as harmful. How can you now claim to be an advocate for accountability when you were part of a government that pushed dangerous rhetoric and divisive actions? Patel took a deep breath, his response calm but forceful. I don't need to justify my role in the administration, he said. What matters now is that we focus on accountability. We need to hold everyone accountable, the media, politicians, public figures. This isn't about defending or attacking individuals. It's about ensuring that the truth is upheld regardless of political affiliation. The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time in the interview, the host seemed at a loss for words. They had expected Patel to become defensive, to apologize for his past actions, but instead he had taken control of the narrative, turning their questions back on them and forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths. And that's when it happened. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been the most composed of the hosts, finally broke the silence. So what's your solution? Kash, she asked, her voice quieter now, as if she was no longer sure of her footing. What do you want us to do differently? Patel paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. Then with a quiet intensity, he answered, we need to start having real conversations. We need to stop playing politics, stop worrying about what side we're on. We need to focus on the facts and let the truth stand on its own. The weight of his words hung in the air. The hosts sat in silence, no longer knowing how to respond. This wasn't just about media criticism. It wasn't even about politics anymore. This was a moral argument, and Kash Patel had just turned it into an unassailable case for truth and accountability. As the interview progressed, it became clear Patel wasn't just defending his position. He was forcing the hosts and the audience to confront their own biases, their own role in perpetuating the media's failure to uphold truth. And in that moment, the power had shifted. The hosts were no longer in control of the conversation. Patel was. The interview was far from over, but the tide had turned. Kash Patel had made his mark, and nothing would be the same after this. By now, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted entirely. What was once an interview designed to challenge Kash Patel had turned into an examination of the media's role in shaping the narrative. The hosts who had expected to grill their guest now found themselves struggling to regain control of the conversation. Patel, unwavering and composed, continued to drive the discussion forward, forcing the hosts into uncomfortable positions with every word he spoke. Whoopi Goldberg, who had maintained a commanding presence throughout the show, now seemed visibly uneasy. She had been the one to ask the toughest questions, the one who usually steered the direction of the conversation. But now she was on the defensive. The audience could feel it. The tension was thick, and every time the host attempted to turn the conversation, Patel responded with logic and calm authority, pushing them further into a corner. Joy Behar, clearly frustrated, leaned forward. Okay, let's talk about your role in the Trump administration. You were a part of one of the most divisive presidencies in recent history. How do you reconcile your involvement with everything you're saying now about accountability? Her words were sharp, accusing trying to cut through Patel's defenses. Patel didn't hesitate. I'm here to talk about accountability, not to defend anyone's actions, he said, his tone steady but firm. The issues I care about go beyond party lines. They're about ensuring that truth, not partisanship, guides our decisions. And that includes holding every institution, whether it's the media, the government, or the public, accountable for their actions. The hosts exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected Patel to become defensive, to shrink back from the scrutiny. Instead, he was standing tall, not just defending his record, but challenging their very framework. His words were not the angry tirades they had anticipated, but calm, measured calls for fairness. And they were resonating with the audience. Sonny Hostin, visibly exasperated, tried again. But your administration, she pressed, attacked the media relentlessly. You're telling us now that the media needs to be accountable, but how can you justify your part in an administration that publicly vilified journalists? Patel's response was deliberate, and once again, he did not back down. I never attacked the press. I criticized its role in pushing false narratives, and there's a difference between the two, he said, his gaze unwavering. But let's not forget that the media has a responsibility too. You cannot ignore the power that the media holds in shaping public perception. If we're going to criticize politicians, we need to criticize the media with the same scrutiny. The room fell silent. The hosts had no immediate reply. Patel had framed the conversation in a way they hadn't expected. He wasn't just talking about political accountability. He was calling out their profession, forcing them to examine their own biases. Whoopi, realizing the stakes, tried to pivot once more. So you're saying that this show is part of the problem? And she asked, her voice more controlled now, but still searching for a way to regain her footing. Patel didn't flinch. Yes, I think every media outlet is part of the problem when they push narratives instead of facts, he said plainly. This show, like many others, has an agenda, whether intentional or not. And when you present information as fact without fully examining the truth, you are part of the problem. The crowd's reaction was immediate. There was a growing buzz in the room, a shift in the energy. Patel wasn't just answering questions anymore. He was challenging the foundation of the media itself. Whoopi, trying to reassert control, leaned in. So, you're not just criticizing the media, you're saying that all of us here at this table are contributing to misinformation. Patel took a moment before responding. I'm saying that everyone who holds power, whether it's in government or in the media, has a responsibility to make sure that truth is the foundation of their reporting. And when that doesn't happen, it's a failure. I'm not here to attack you personally. I'm here to ask why the truth has been compromised for so long. The silence that followed was deafening. The hosts, for the first time, seemed unsure of how to respond. The conversation had taken a turn they weren't prepared for, and it was clear they weren't going to be able to wrest control from Patel. The audience's response was even more telling. There was a noticeable shift. Applause, tentative at first, began to grow louder. It wasn't the polite applause of an audience showing support for a guest. It was the kind of applause that comes when a person finally makes their point undeniable. Patel had done more than defend his position. He had exposed the flaws in the very system that the hosts represented. He had turned their questions into opportunities to expose the media's shortcomings, and in doing so, he had gained control of the conversation. And as the interview continued, it was clear that the hosts, despite their attempts to regain their composure, had lost. Kash Patel wasn't just surviving the interview, he was reshaping it and reshaping the conversation around truth and accountability in a way that no one at that table had anticipated. The room was electric with attention that hadn't been there before. Kash Patel had not only held his own, he had dominated the conversation, shifting the focus from his own actions to the broader issues of truth, accountability, and media bias. As the host tried and failed to regain control, it was clear that the narrative was no longer in their hands. Whoopi Goldberg, who had once been the undisputed leader of the table, now appeared conflicted. She glanced at her co-hosts, searching for some sign of support, but even they seemed unsure of how to respond. This was no longer a battle of wits. It was a reckoning. Well, Kash, Whoopi said, slowly, her voice now tinged with something that resembled reluctant respect. You've certainly made your point, but Patel wasn't done yet. He had already exposed the flaws in their framework, but there was one last thing he wanted to make clear. It's not just about making a point, he said calmly. It's about starting a conversation, one that challenges all of us, not just politicians or journalists, but every single person who watches this show. We need to question everything, including the narratives we've been fed. The final words hung in the air. There was no applause, no cheers, just the heavy silence of realization. The hosts had underestimated Patel. They had expected him to be a mere figurehead, a talking head to interrogate. Instead, he had flipped the script. And now the conversation wasn't just about his past, it was about theirs. Whoopi, visibly taken aback, took a long pause before answering. Well, that's certainly food for thought. The audience was quiet for a moment longer before an unexpected sound filled the room. A soft, almost reluctant clap. Then another. Slowly, the applause began to build, not with the force of a cheer, but with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't a wave of support, it was a sign of recognition. Patel had done what no one thought possible. He had turned the tables on. The View. For the first time in the interview, the hosts were left speechless. Kash Patel had not only survived the barrage of questions, but had emerged victorious. The room was no longer just a place for debate. It was a stage for truth to be revealed. As the applause continued, Patel stood nodding to the audience. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't gloating. He had come to deliver a message, and now that message had been heard. Without another word, he turned to leave the stage, leaving behind a stunned set of hosts and an audience that would never forget the moment when the narrative was finally turned upside down. And as the cameras pulled away, the silence in the studio spoke volumes. The world had just witnessed a confrontation that would echo long after the lights dimmed. Kash Patel had come to disrupt, and he had done so quietly, but undeniably.